Welcome to Calvary Baptist Church. We're going to start with a song. So if you can and you're able to and you want to, please stand with us. Who has held the ocean in his hand? Who has numbered every grain of sand? Kings and kingdoms tremble at his voice. All creation rises to rejoice. Behold our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold our King, nothing can compare. Come, let us adore him. Who has given counsel to the Lord? Who can question any of his words? Who can teach the one who knows all things? Who can fathom all his wondrous deed? Behold our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold our King, nothing can compare. Come, let us adore him. Who has felt the nails upon his hands, bearing all the guilt of sinful man? God eternal, humble to the grave, Jesus Savior, risen now to reign. Behold our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold our King, nothing can compare. Come, let us adore him. You will reign forever. 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 Behold our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold our King, nothing can compare. Come, let us adore him. Thank you. You may be seated.
Well, good evening. If you would, turn to Daniel chapter 7. Daniel 7. We left off in 6 last week, and we usually tend to do things one verse at a time here at Calvary. So if you finish chapter 6, then you start in chapter 7. That's where we're at. Let me do just a bunch of setup first before we kind of dive in. So after the chapters 1 through 6 are kind of largely historical, and then 7 through 12 are largely prophetic. And so we're going to kind of make a turn now, and we're going to deal with prophecy in the book of Daniel. People tend to make two mistakes when they get to this section of Daniel. One is they totally geek out on like all of the future prophecy, things that's going to happen, who, what, when, where. Let me make a chart. which I love charts, by the way. But we can focus on that, but still kind of miss really the whole theme of Daniel, which is God's sovereign protection of his people. The other thing that some people tend to do is to say, well, people make too much about the prophecy in the book, and then they go on to ignore all the prophecy in the book. And so hopefully we want to deal with the prophecy, but keep our eye on the goal, that the reason why God is telling us what's going to happen is because he wants us to be confident in his sovereign care of how he handles history. Okay? God knows what's happening. God knows what will happen. God has determined what he will do, how he will bring an end to history, that is his story. And so we just want to keep that in mind. If you remember, when God is talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, and he says, shall I not tell Abraham what I'm going to do? And he does. And that has always been kind of one of the privileges of being God's people, is that God reveals what he's going to do. So we don't want to ignore that. If God has gone to the trouble of revealing what his plan is for history, we as his people should desire to know that. So chapter 7 is very much about this figure called the Antichrist. The New Testament calls him the Antichrist. He is called the beast. He is called the man of sin. He is called the son of destruction. In this chapter, he is going to be called the little horn. Okay? He opposes God. He is empowered by Satan. And in the same way that the book of Revelation is all about the revelation of Jesus Christ, much of this last half of Daniel is about revealing who Jesus' adversary is, about the Antichrist. And something we'll see in this chapter too is, when you kind of see like a thundercloud off in the distance, you know that the storm is on its way. The Antichrist very much serves that role in Scripture. When, at whatever point the Antichrist appears on the scene, the appearance of the Son of Man will be immediately after. Okay, and so once this figure appears, Jesus' return is imminent. Daniel 7 is about what the Bible calls the time of the Gentiles. So this period of the time of the Gentiles is from the time of when Jerusalem is taken captive, clear through this time of Babylon, the Medo-Persians, Greece, up through Rome, up through now, up through whenever the tribulation, kind of a glimpse into the tribulation. That is the time of the Gentiles. You're going to notice tonight that everything we talk about tonight is going to be really deja vu to chapter 2. Okay? This vision that Daniel has is very much like the vision that Nebuchadnezzar has. And it speaks of, it reveals the same thing. And if you remember when we hit chapter 2, I didn't spend a lot of time explaining what all that means because I knew I was going to do it again now in this chapter. In chapter 2, God gives a dream to a pagan man, Nebuchadnezzar. And he has a vision of what the kingdoms of the earth are like from man's perspective. And what was it? It was a glorious statue. It was an idol of man's glory. In chapter 7, we see those same kingdoms, but now the vision is given not to a pagan man, but to a godly man, to Daniel. And now we see the kingdoms of the world from God's perspective. And it's no longer a glorious idol, it's a terrible beast. Okay? It's a bloodthirsty creature. And so that's what happens in 7. But this does give hope to Israel. Israel could look at this and see, even in the midst of this kind of terrible prophecy, it's always God knows where they are, God knows where they're going, God knows what he's going to do. Okay? And that's what we pull away from this. And it's also a warning to the Gentile nations, right? Because even all these nations that think our kingdoms are so grand, okay? what this chapter warns is your kingdoms are only grand as long as God allows them to be grand. And whenever God's purposes with you are through, then your kingdom will be through. So, with all that intro, let's look at verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay on his bed. Now, first off, notice kind of there's a little shift in time here. We're back to King Belshazzar. So, actually, chapter 7 takes place at the same time as chapter 5. When Daniel's in the lion's den, that occurs after 7. So the book is a bit out of order time-wise, but it's kind of going thematically. So it says Daniel wrote this dream down, and he related the following summary of it. Daniel said, I was looking in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. The great sea is the idea of the Mediterranean Sea, but beyond the Mediterranean Sea was all these Gentile nations. It's the world beyond it. So the sea kind of stands in for everything that happens in the world beyond. He says, and it's stirred up. Okay? There's kind of a great storm coming, and that is really the history of the world. The history of the world is not a story of peace and love. It's a story of struggle and conflict. Verse 3, and four great beasts were coming up from the sea, different from one another. Now, what are these four beasts? If you look ahead to Daniel 17, he's going to get this kind of interpretation. He's going to say, these great beasts are four in numbers. They are four kings that arise from the earth. So these are four world leaders and their kingdoms. Verse 4. The first was like a lion, and he had the wings of an eagle. And I kept looking until its wings were plucked, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. A human mind was given it to it. So we know from chapter 2, this is the head of gold from that vision. This is Nebuchadnezzar. When it talks about that he was, his wings were plucked, there was this time when God humbles Nebuchadnezzar, and he was proud before the Lord, and the Lord wanted to put him in his place, and he ends up grazing like a cow for 7 years. And then it says, and a human mind was given him. God restores Nebuchadnezzar. He's made to stand. That is the first beast that we see. Behold, another beast, a second one, resembling a bear. And it was raised up on one side, and 3 ribs were in its mouth between its teeth. And thus they said to it, arise, devour much meat. Now, in the previous vision, there was the chest and arms of silver. And the 2 arms represented kind of the Medo-Persian Empire, the kind of the 2 parts of this empire. In this vision, it says it's a bear, but it's raised up on one side. And the idea there is the Persian Empire kind of ascended to greater power than the Medes. And so the Persian side of that kingdom was greater. And it says there were 3 ribs in its mouth. Interestingly, there was 3 provinces in Babylon. And it is the Medo-Persian Empire that consumes Babylon and takes its place. Verse 6, after this I kept looking, and behold, another one like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Now this is a curious one. So in the previous vision, you have Greece is the belly of bronze. And here you have this creature that is a leopard, which is very fast. And it has 4 wings of a bird. The idea is it's fast and it has great reach. It can go very far. Do we know anybody from Greece that conquered quickly great swaths of the world? Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, by the time he was 25, had conquered an area 3 continents wide, and I wrote down 2 million square miles. At 25, it's recorded that he wept because he had no more world to conquer. Okay? Swift and vast. But what are these 4 heads? Well, Alexander the Great had 4 generals. And just so you know that I'm not making it up, it's Antigonus, Cassander, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. Maybe that's the way it's pronounced. So those 4 generals divided up amongst themselves Alexander the Great's kingdom when he was gone. Verse 7, and I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrifying, extremely strong. It had large iron teeth, and it devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And it was different from all the other beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Okay, let's set aside that 10 horns part for a minute. So in the other vision in chapter 2, there was these legs of iron, and that represented the kingdom of Rome, the Roman Empire. And this one is described as especially dreadful and especially terrifying because although the other kingdoms conquered to expand their power and their reach, Rome killed for its own enjoyment. Rome made an entire industry in the Colosseum of watching men and beasts die for their entertainment. Rome was an especially bloodthirsty nation. And so that represents that. But then he talks about, he says, and it had 10 horns. Now, in chapter 2, it talks about when you get to the bottom of this statue, there was feet that was iron and clay. So it's kind of like the Roman Empire that's mixed in, but it's also weaker. And it has 10 toes, so it's kind of like these 10 parts of it. And now when we get to chapter 7, he reveals that, well, this part of this nation that's rising also has 10 things, 10 parts, 10 horns. He says, verse 8, while I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots before it. And behold, the horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boasts. A horn is typically a symbol of power. But this horn, it says, has eyes, and it speaks, and it utters things. This horn is a person. It's a singular person. So we're not merely talking about kind of a broad nation, but a figure. Verse 20 says kind of the same thing, if you'd ratchet down ahead there. The horn had eyes and a mouth uttering great boasts that was larger in appearance than its associates. I kept looking, and the horn was waging war with the saints and overpowering them. So this figure does a handful of things. One is he defeats 3 of the other nations. There's this 10-part kind of Roman confederacy, and this figure defeats 3 of them. Kind of in his rise to power. He gains clout as kind of a sort of an ascendancy to power. He defeats 3 of the others. And what does he do? Well, he utters great boasts. This isn't just that he's proud of himself. The uttering great boast is the idea of uttering great boast against God. He's uttering blasphemies. This figure is putting himself in the place of God and expecting to be treated with the same kind of reverence and fear and respect that God has. Again, Paul will say this one is going to enter God's temple and he's going to display himself for worship. We're going to talk some more about that actually next week, in the chapter next week. Verse 24, just kind of back and forth as we look ahead. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will arise, another will rise after them. He will be different from the previous ones. He will subdue 3 kings. He will speak out against the Most High. Kind of makes it plain that these boasts that he's uttering is speaking against God. He will wear down the saints of the highest one. He will intend to make alterations in the times and in law. That's a strange phrase. And they will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. Okay? So what does this Antichrist do? He speaks blasphemy against God. He persecutes God's people. And also it says alterations in times and in law. Okay? So for Jewish people, for for their life was governed by what? This calendar of holy days and all the things they did for times and seasons and special days, and then the laws that govern their life. So someone that has the power to make alterations in their times and in their laws, the Jewish people reading this would see this is someone who is controlling the religious life of Israel. This is someone that can tell you when you can pray and if you can worship. This person is kind of the final embodiment of all of man's wickedness and all of Satan's schemes. Notice it says a time, times, and half a time, that's one, times, that's two, and a half a time, that's 3.5. So that gets revealed a little bit more in the book of Revelation when we hear about this tribulation period of 7 years that's treated in 3.5 years and then 3.5 years. Okay? It's been, this is kind of new information, really. The chapter 2 said there was going to be this 10 nation, this strange amalgamation of nations. But it didn't tell us anything about the Antichrist. It didn't tell us anything about this person that would oppose God and oppose God's people. And this is new. And really, we know who Nebuchadnezzar is. We know what the Medo-Persian Empire is. We know what Alexander the Great is. We know what Rome is. And then really between that part and this other nation that we see in the future, there's kind of a big gap. And later, we're going to hit that later on. Daniel talks about that too, this time where we wait for this upcoming kingdom to arise. And it's been 20 centuries, actually more, since this prophecy was given. Has man gotten any better? Do we see, mankind look to the heavens and say, "O sovereign, come rule us"? Okay? We don't seek political power. We want God to reign over us. Is that the cry of the nations of the earth? Okay. No, so we are very much in the same place. At every point in history, mankind has rebelled against God. And so the Antichrist will only expose the rebellious hearts of people. And we keep going back and forth to chapter 2, and if you keep thinking about that, then probably the next thing you're thinking of is, but Eric, chapter 2 recorded this stone, not cut by human hands. This is not a human creation, but one comes from heaven and crushes the kingdoms of the earth and establishes his own. Is there a parallel to that in this chapter? Okay, look at verse 9. And I kept looking until thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days took his seat, and his vesture was like white snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool, and his throne was ablaze with flames. Its wheels were burning a fire. A river of fire was flowing and coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands were attending him, and myriads upon myriads were standing before him. The court sat, and the books were open. You get this scene of a throne room and him who sits on it. And the throne is on fire, and from the throne comes like a river of lava, and it's surrounded by angels and thousands and myriads of the heavenly host around the throne. Verse 11, then I kept looking because the sound of the boastful words which the horn was speaking, I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body was destroyed and given to the burning fire. As for the rest of the beast, their dominion was taken away. But an extension of life was granted to them for an appointed period of time. Just like the stone destroys the kingdom of the world, we see one here comes and he destroys the Antichrist. And all the kingdoms of the earth are subdued. God is going to give judgment to this one man, okay, his representative, who is glorious and sovereign and just. This is going to be the last Adam to rule the earth. Who can this man be? Shh. Okay. Who could this person be that has never sinned? This one who is perfect in wisdom, knowledge, and power. Verse 13, and I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. Do you ever wonder why in the Gospels it seems like Jesus' favorite title for himself was the Son of Man? That's a reference to here. That's why. To make it perfectly clear who he was, who he claimed to be. Okay? He was the one like the Son of Man that was in the fiery furnace. This is one like a Son of Man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. When Moses asked to see God, what did God say? Yeah, no one can see me and live. Okay? The God's glorious presence incinerates people that aren't worthy to be there. Okay? The seraphim that surround the throne are on fire. Who is this one that's able to just stand presented before the Ancient of Days? Who could this one be? All the peoples, the nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion. See, that's the problem with earthly kings. Okay? Even if you were perchance to get a good one, okay? Men are finite, and their rule is finite. And usually when they pass away and their children argue over the throne or whatever happens to that kingdom or that government, usually if it is benevolent, it's short-lived. But this benevolent kingdom lasts forever, which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which cannot be destroyed. Who is this one that stands before the Ancient of Days, has dominion, glory, all the peoples of the earth worship and serve him? His rule is eternal, and his kingdom will never end. Now, if you were an Old Testament Jew, this would really kind of leave you with a quandary. Who is this one who is like a son of man? He's a man. He's truly a man. But he stands before the throne of God. His dominion is forever. He's righteous and holy and worthy. Who could they imagine would be this, I don't know, call him a God-man? Who would that be? And then if you happen to be born on Saturn or something, then that one is the one who was born in Bethlehem. He was the one who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, but born under the Virgin Mary. He did all kind of miracles that no person could ever do. He never sinned. He lived a righteous life. Pilate said in him he could find no guilt. His executioner said, this man has done nothing wrong. Okay? The man dying next to him said, we are suffering for what we deserve, but this man has done no wrong. His betrayer says, I have betrayed innocent blood. Even the demons call him the Holy One of God. And when God the Father had the opportunity to give testimony, he speaks from heaven and says, behold, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Look down at verse 27. Then the sovereignty, the dominion, and the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all the dominions will serve and obey him. This gracious Messiah, this God-man, this eternal King, brings along a people to enjoy his kingdom. Okay? And this Messiah exalts God, and he exalts God's people. That's what's coming for the saints. Okay? An end to wicked kingdoms of the world, and the coming of a kingdom where righteousness reigns forever, where it's always good and right and holy and just. And the Messiah brings along people that don't deserve to be there. Why? Because he's good and he's gracious. And so we are kind of at this point in time between Rome and this revived Roman Empire, whatever it may be like. And I don't know how long that period is going to last. But it kind of reminds me, as I was thinking of this today, is kind of the period where Noah is building the ark and he's preaching and he's saying rain is going to come. Okay? God's judgment is coming. Come escape the judgment of God. And for that period of time, it seemed like judgment would not come. Okay? Until it did. Until the people felt the first drops of rain on their face. And that's kind of where we are. That we're at this point in time, and the ark is built, and judgment is coming, and the rains are approaching, and whatever point the Messiah or the Antichrist appears, then the Messiah is going to be right on the heels of that, like a thundercloud. And in that time, God is summoning a people for himself of every people and nation and tribe and tongue who will believe him and enter the ark of safety, that those that will enter Jesus and be saved and be rescued. And that is the time we live in, this kind of mystery of the church age. And that just brings us up to a glimpse of some of these things. Next week, we really dial in the microscope and are going to look at more of those things. Does anybody have any really simple questions you want to give me that aren't complicated at all? I don't know. I'm not. Anyone else at all?
When you said something about the Antichrist, it just made me think, do you think that it would be possible for us to tell who he is before he, declares that we have to take the mark?
That's a good question. Lots of people make an industry out of predicting who it is. No, I don't know. It talks about, the Bible says that the beast and the false prophet are going to deceive many, and if possible, even the elect. The idea that it's so persuasive and so deceptive that that it deceives everyone right up to, but not including the elect. So the elect at least have a sense of, this guy isn't what everyone else thinks he is. This guy isn't a wonderful world leader that's going to usher in peace and safety. God's people see through that. Do they see through it far enough to say, you know what, this is the Antichrist? I don't know. Chris?
Outside of Revelation, I'm trying to think, is there anywhere else where we see like dreamlike prophecy that doesn't get explained in the text? It's like Joseph in the coat of many collars, like
Right.
He has dream prophecy several times and explains pharaohs and all that, but we always get the explanation for what it is. Here in Daniel is the only time I can think of where we have prophecy that it's not directly described in the text now or later.
It is explained in the text that it's like, oh, hey, this is, these pictures that you're seeing of these terrible beasts, these portions of a statue, these are kingdoms, these are kings.
But not like the breakdown like you gave.
Right.
Like when all of Jesus' prophecies were fulfilled, it was like, that is definitely, and there's a lot of that degree here where it's like, okay, well, that was obviously Rome, and that was obviously Alexander the Great.
There's a reason why some skeptics work really hard to try to date Daniel in the 1st century instead of in the time that it really is. Why? Because then they can just describe it and say, man, these prophecies that sure look like they're spot on, They were just written afterward. Okay? But there's tons of evidence that these are as early as they say. I don't know. I get what you're saying, but usually when there's prophecies, there's at least some sense of interpretation. If the interpretation is immediate, let's say like Joseph's, he's like, hey, this is, the sun, Dad, that's you. Moon, that's you, Mom. All these sheaves bound down to me, brothers, that's you. But see, the interpretation was very robust because its fulfillment was immediate. I don't think in things that look this far ahead that you get, it would really be crazy if right in the text it said, oh, and by the way, this is Alexander the Great.
Because it's so referring to the Antichrist and the time of the Antichrist, God's not revealing to us.
Right. Yeah.
These things are to happen.
Yeah. This little horn, by the way, his name is Steve. He's from 6th Street in Brazil.
He has given us enough information to watch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It may not be totally clear, but it does tell you about the abomination of the temple and those things.
And that's where we're going next.
We have to be using our brain.
Yeah. And enough to know this is real life that God's talking about, and maybe not enough to know all the details we would like to know, but definitely enough to know what God wants us to know, which is, I hold the future. God controls history.
So do you think the Antichrist happens during the tribulation, or like obviously it's after the rapture, right? When he rises to power?
Yeah, I mean, he has to have some degree of clout.
He'll already be somewhat in place, I would think.
Yeah.
Because he'd have to be ready to just take
Is that what you think?
Yeah. Yeah.
I've got a question to throw you off because I just thought of.
You always throw me off, Gene.
No, you're real smart, and I'm impressed with what you did. I learned a lot tonight. Thank you.
Okay.
I was very impressed. But I just thought of this week, based on when the rapture happens and when the tribulation starts and stuff. Doesn't there have to be a temple during that 7-year period that's already there? So if the rapture happens and then the tribulation starts, are they gonna have time to build a temple like in that first 3.5 years? This is something I've listened to this stuff for years.
Yeah, lots of people talk about that, like when, if the Antichrist walks into the temple, does something that desecrates it, and then demands to be worshipped. If that's what's revealed in the Bible, then there must be a temple and an altar to walk into. But how much of that is, does it need to be like the temple in Jerusalem in Jesus' day? Or could it be, next to the Wailing Wall, it's begun, and the implements and the bronze bowl and the table and those things exist and are out?
They have them already, I think. I was
Yes,
there
they
years
do.
ago, and they were doing that. They have all the stuff ready. But,
Yeah.
Like
So
the
how
Lord
much
of the
needs to be
Rocks,
done for that to happen?
she says they build stuff
They
quickly
do build
nowadays.
a lot of things pretty quickly nowadays.
But would it have to be built before that first 3.5 years of the 7-year tribulation, or?
Yes.
Yeah, something has to exist. I guess what I'm saying is it may not have to be a full-blown completed temple like we see.
Doesn't have to be done.
Yeah, it could be. Jewish Old Testament worship could begin tomorrow if they wanted it to. They have all those things.
Yeah, they have the stuff that goes in it. They
Yeah.
had that years ago when I was there. They were working on it.
Yeah,
Yeah. But the Dome of the Rock, isn't that where the Holy of Holies was?
that's what they say. Yeah,
Because I've seen that. I have a picture. I didn't know I
Yeah.
would not take a picture, but I did years ago. I didn't know it. I did.
yeah,
But so that's the Muslims have that now. So
yeah. And there's, so the Antichrist makes some kind of treaty with Israel at some point. is access to the Dome of the Rock some part of that treaty that he's going to break later on? A lot of people really speculate out on some of the details, and I try to be careful to just stay with what the text says. My imagination totally geeks out on it, so I could totally do that too.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate you giving me what you did. I wanted to ask that question Sunday.
All righty, let's, I forgot to bring something to write on here. Aha, no I do. Okay. So let us share some prayer requests. And I think a really appropriate thing to pray for is before we do that though, yeah, we should say goodbye to our live stream friends. I don't always remember to give Chris the cue to shut that down.